Okay, I've got 9 o'clock. It looks like it's about time to get started. Everybody's here, I see. They're pouring in. Okay, my topic is 10 things you should know about socialism, and it's basically based on my book, The Problem with Socialism. And a couple years ago, Regnery Publishing contacted me. They contacted Tom Woods first, but he said Tom Woods Incorporated keeps them too busy. So he said, call DiLorenzo. So they called me and asked me if I could, because they had been reading these opinion polls. One opinion poll said 69% of people under 30 said they would vote for a socialist for president. And so that's kind of alarming to hear that in America. And so they asked me if I could put together a short book for the millennial generation about making the case against socialism. And they asked if I could do it in 5 weeks. And I did. It was in this off season. I wasn't teaching, so just all day, every day, 4 weeks. I churned out the book, and so anyways, that's the purpose of the book. And so I thought I'm going to summarize some of the main points about socialism, things you ought to know about socialism. Maybe these are talking points that'll help you debate your commie roommate back at school or someone like that. Might even help you get kicked out of school. Who knows? Which would be a good thing for some people. So socialism defined. The classic definition in the early 20th century was government ownership of the means of production. So when you see countries becoming more and more socialist, it means their governments have been taking over various means of production. When the British nationalized all of the commanding heights of their economy after World War II, they became more and more socialist. And so they didn't become totally socialist in the central planning sense like the Soviet Union, but they lurched in the direction of socialism. And now in Friedrich Hayek's famous book, The Road to Serfdom, in the 1976 edition, he argued that over the years, between the early 20th century and then, mid-70s, the definition of socialism had changed. He said that it changed to include the institutions of the welfare state and the progressive income tax, because in his words, the ostensible goal was always egalitarianism, or the pursuit of equality through forceful governmental coercion, and the means just changed. He said the original means were the government ownership of the means of production, and that didn't work out too well. And so they switched to different means, the welfare state and a progressive income tax. And so that was Hayek's idea. And now, I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, read at least some of von Mises's book, Socialism. It's a great classic. It's online. It's for sale here at the Mises Institute. And in the latter chapters of socialism, Mises says that an important part of socialism is what he called destructionism. And in the spirit of Patrick's deciphering of Murray Rothbard's bad handwriting, I wrote it down, Patrick Newman's bad handwriting. I wrote down just a minute ago, one of the things that Mises said in the book about destructionism. He said, destruction is the essence of socialism. Socialism produces nothing. It only consumes what the social order, based on private ownership and the means of production, has created. And so when you see politicians today who call themselves socialists advocating reparations for slavery, a guaranteed annual income, free health care for everybody, free education, free this, free that, that's basically what they're doing. They're saying we want to loot and plunder the fruits of past efforts of production under private property and give it away in order to prop ourselves up as with political power and to be sort of Uber Santa Claus. Just giving everything away. Government as Santa Claus is how I think of it. And so that's what destructionism is. And that, by the way, the group of socialists who came to America in the 1940s, who were known as cultural Marxists, their theory was that The reason why the Europeans did not voluntarily embrace socialism was that they were too wedded to the institutions and ideas of Western civilization, including the ideas of capitalism, in particular, and private property and so forth, and Christianity. They were too wedded to Christianity. Therefore, the ideas and institutions of Western civilization and the ideas of Christianity must be destroyed in order to have socialist utopia. And that, in my view, is why you see all these attacks on the traditional family, always on capitalism for sure, and just the tearing down of monuments and the painting over of murals and things like that. These are all attacks on the institutions of Western civilization, and it's all part of the game plan of destructionism. Okay, so that's socialism. Point number 2 is socialism will destroy your economic future. I got a laugh last week when the chief of staff of this Cortez woman, the bartender from Westchester County who got elected to Congress by pretending she's from the Bronx, and the author of the Green New Deal, which Bob Murphy is going to talk about later on today, he came out and admitted, he said, it has nothing to do with the climate. It's all about socialism. It's all about socialism. Okay, and so the reason I got a chuckle, it's sort of, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, is that all the young people, all the millennials who are on board with this, the Green New Deal, it's all about destroying their economic future with socialism. That's what it's all about. And at the same time, granting tremendous amounts of power to creatures like this guy, the chief of staff of this woman, the Cortez woman. And that's what it's all about. And so just study history a little bit. The Soviet Union, our friend Yuri Maltsev, who was an advisor to Mikhail Gorbachev, who's lectured here many times, when he defected from the Soviet Union, he started telling our government, the U.S. government, that the size of the U.S. economy or the Soviet economy was no more than 5% of the U.S. economy. At the time, the CIA was telling everybody it was 65%. And also at the time, in the 1989 edition of Paul Samuelson's famous textbook, the Principles of Economics textbook, which was the biggest selling textbook in the world from the 1940s until the 1980s, he predicted that, this was 1989, he predicted that by 2000, the Soviet economy would be bigger than the US economy. That's what mainstream economics was teaching college students in 1989 on the verge of the total collapse of the Soviet Union. But Yuri was right. It was more like 5%. The CIA was wrong. It wasn't 65%. Country after country. Africa, after independence, they adopted Soviet socialism and central planning. Their logo was, quote, "Only socialism can save Africa." 40 years later, these African countries were poorer than they were under colonialism. Venezuela today, need I say more? There's going to be a presentation about the disaster that socialism has created in Venezuela on Saturday, and I encourage everybody to go and listen to it. England, after World War II, adopted their version of socialism, Fabian socialism. They nationalized many of the major industries. By the 1970s, the whole world was talking about the British disease because they had ruined their economy, and that's what led to the election of Margaret Thatcher, who promised, who was a student of Hayek, not a formal student, but she read Hayek, and she turned things around quite a bit. She wasn't exactly a Ron Paul, but they did move in the other direction. Argentina adopted its version of socialism in the 1940s and 50s under Perón, and then and he of course quickly ruined the Argentine economy and was replaced with a coup. And Argentina, like all these other countries, once they destroyed the productive capacity of their country, they tried to bail themselves out by printing money. And Argentina, by the 1980s, had 12,000% price inflation. Okay, Chile, the same thing. The country of Chile adopted socialism in the 1970s. They ended up with 746% inflation and an economy that simply stood still, just destroyed it. And then they were That government was overthrown by sort of a repressive regime after that. So not a happy history of country after country. And you might have noticed that a lot of these countries are democracies. Friedrich Bastiat wrote in his famous essay, The Law, that there's really no difference. If the government imposes a uniform policy on the whole country, a dictator can do it and a legislature can do it. So there's really no difference. You can impose socialism with a legislature like Venezuela did. You don't need dictatorship to have socialism. You don't need the Soviet Union to ruin your economy. Okay. Point number 3 is you cannot fix socialism. After Bill Clinton left office, there was one of his top economic advisors penned an article in the New York Times arguing that socialism is not such a bad idea. It just needs to be administered by smart people like us. And that's always been the argument by the left that, well, just the wrong people have managed socialism. Well, that ignores economics. You cannot fix it. The original explanation for why socialism is economically poisonous was the incentive problem. And I joke with my principles of economics classes. On the first day, I tell them, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give 7 exams during the course of the 14-week semester. I'm going to add up, and then when I get all the grades, those of you who get the low grades, I'm going to take points away from the good students who got the high grades and give you some of their points so that everybody gets a C. And I tell them, well, that's academic socialism. That's sort of an example of the incentive problem. And that's not really enough of an explanation, though. You've all learned about the calculation problem. You need private property and market prices in order to have rational economic calculation. And so that's another cause for the ruination caused by socialism. Hayek is famous for what he called the knowledge problem, the fact that it's unthinkable that a human mind or even 100 human minds working with the most powerful computer in the world could possibly possess and utilize all of the information that the millions of workers and consumers and business managers and investors and on have that they use in their daily lives. It's a pretense. He called it the pretense of knowledge. And then there's also something I would call the public choice problem involved with socialism. The way Hayek put it was, under socialism, the only power worth having is political power. That is, the way to acquire things to make yourself better off is through politics and political connection, bribery, and just plain old politics. You can't advance by educating yourself, being a producer, being an entrepreneur, serving your fellow man by providing him or her with valued goods and services. That's illegal. That's the government is control. You're not in control. You're not allowed to do that. And so the way to succeed is through politics. And and of course, the more and more people spend on politics, by definition, the less time they spend producing things. And so that extracts even more in terms of time and resources used for production in the direction of transferring what little wealth there is left into your pocket, you being the rent seeker, the rent-seeking involved in politics. So you cannot fix socialism once you have it. Also under socialism, there's a famous chapter in Hayek's book, The Road to Serfdom, called Why the Worst Rise to the Top. And it made me think of something that I call the sleazometer, where you might put people like Stalin on one end over here, maybe Chuck Schumer over here, and then some of the nicer ones, some of the moderates, like this woman in England. She doesn't seem too horrible, Theresa May, but so that's sort of like the sleazometer with the extreme sleaze on the left side, on this side over here, and then people who they're still sort of coercive thugs, but they're not as bad as Stalin. So not as bad as Stalin. But Hayek's article is, under socialism, collectivism. He was talking about collectivism in general. It's based on using the coercive force of government to compel people to take your orders. The Mises Institute has a new T-shirt. What does it say? It says, every socialist is a secret dictator. That is certainly true. I think that's a quote from von Mises. And it's all a matter of degree. You had some of the socialist dictators like Stalin who are willing to murder tens of millions of people for merely dissenting. Okay, and Theresa May, as far as I know, hasn't done anything at all like that. But she still has inherited the accumulated vehicles of coercion that are the state, that have accumulated over hundreds of years in England, and the same thing in our government. When Donald Trump was elected, he inherited the accumulated coercive powers of 200 and some years of U.S. government, and then the next person will do the same. Whoever gets elected next time will do the same, and so that's always a danger. Even if you have relatively nice-sounding people in power, they've got these horrible weapons at their disposal. And so the worst, the absolute worst in history is something you should know about. I had some students at my university once. It was like the College Republican Club, and on the day when the students all put little tables out on the campus and they were handing out flyers about them, they took a couple of them were taking one of my classes, and they had these statistics of mass murders by socialist governments, and they were handing out, and they told me that none of their classmates had ever heard anything about this. They never knew that a single person died because of socialism anywhere. And this is from a book called The Black Book of Communism. There's a sociologist from the University of Hawaii, Rudy Rummel, who wrote a book called Democide. And what this is not death by war. This is mass killing of people because they dissented from socialism. They did not want their property taken. They did not want to live under a tyranny, and as a result, they were murdered in mass. And these were 7 French scholars who published this book about some 20 years ago, maybe more than 20 years ago now. But also Rudolf Rummel's book. What a career he had, isn't it? Cataloging mass killing. He spent his whole life working with statistics on mass death. His whole life. He must have been pretty depressed. Wouldn't be the kind of guy you'd want to go out and have a party with. What would you talk about? So anyway, the Soviet Union, 20 million. Our friend Yuri thinks it's a low ball estimate. China, 60 million. North Korea, 2 million. Eastern Europe, 1 million. Africa, 1.7 million. And so when Hayek said the worst rise to the top, that's the sort of thing he was talking about in his day. This is in the 1940s. He was mentioning this. And so you should familiarize yourself with that. And this is not to say that Theresa May is the same as Stalin, but it's all a matter of degree of coercion, isn't it? Okay. The next point is that most people don't know that fascism is a form of socialism. Fascism, socialism, communism, it's all the same gang as far as I'm concerned. They're all collectivists. After all, when I wrote this book, and I did lots of radio interviews, Regnery Publishing had me do 65 radio talk shows in a month. And so I was busy, 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm on the radio with a California radio station. And they own several hundred radio stations, the same company, Salem Communications. And a question I've always asked is, people would ask me, isn't communism different than socialism? And the answer is no. The Soviets, the name of their country was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. They didn't call themselves the Union of Soviet Communist Republics. Communism was the utopian ideal that they hoped to achieve in 500 years. But in the meantime, they're all socialists. They call themselves socialists, so it's the same thing. So don't fall for that. And of course, Hayek and the Road to Serfdom point out that all the fascists of the 20th century, Mussolini, Stalin, and the rest, they all started out as socialists. And of course, Nazi, the word Nazi is National Socialism. So the Russians called themselves International Socialists. The German socialists called themselves National Socialists. But they were all socialists, just a different variety of socialism. That's like, I'm a murderer who likes to use guns and he likes to use knives, but we're the same thing. We're both murderers. Guns, knives, what's the difference? And so, and of course, another thing they had in common was the literature of the fascists all attacked liberalism, classical liberalism. And these are, von Mises' book, Liberalism, which is online also and also for sale at the Mises Institute. You should all read it. These, the main points, what is liberalism? What are the main bullet points of classical liberalism? Private property, freedom, peace, equality under the law, inequality of income in a free market, limited government, and tolerance. These are the basic ideas that Mises lists there. These are the ideas that were attacked very voraciously by Mussolini himself and Hitler and the Nazis, because they understood who the enemy was. These were the ideas, and the ideas that laid the groundwork for the acceptance of markets and capitalism and private property. Okay, you can't have capitalism and private property and markets if people don't understand the virtues of it. I guess you can have it, but it's tough. It makes it a lot tougher. And so here's a few quotes about from the horse's mouth about fascism. Here's Hayek again. Hayek noted in the Road to Serfdom. He said this: the dominant feature of Nazi Germany, he's referring to Nazi Germany, was a fierce hatred of anything capitalistic, individual profit-seeking, large-scale enterprise, banks, joint stock companies, department stores, international finance and loan capital, and the system of what they called interest slavery. They equated a bank charging you interest for a loan as slavery in general. He says, quote, the Nazis was, the common characteristic of the Nazis was their anti-liberal and anti-capitalist trend. They even adopted the slogan, quote, the end of capitalism, as their accepted dogma. So that was the slogan of the Nazi ideologues that wrote about that. Mussolini said much of the same thing. I read Mussolini's autobiography once when I'm doing some of my research, and it's kind of funny. If you assigned, say you assigned a class of third graders and said, write a one-page autobiography. I could see the third grader writing the title, My Autobiography. That was the title of Mussolini's autobiography, my Autobiography. And I always thought it sounded sort of elementary schoolish. But he also wrote a book called Fascism, Doctrine and Institutions. He said this: the fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests coincide with the state. It is opposed to classical liberalism, which denied the state in the name of the individual. So that it doesn't get any more clear than that there was an attack on classical liberalism. These ideas, you had to destroy these ideas first before you could have fascism, in the words of Benito Mussolini. He also complained about, and this is a quote, the selfish pursuit of material prosperity. He declared fascism to be a reaction against the flaccid materialistic conception of happiness and implored his audiences to, quote, reject the economistic literature of the 18th century. So don't read Adam Smith. Okay, don't read that. Sounds like the kind of thing they tell in American college campuses today. Don't read this stuff. It's a racist, it's sexist. Adam Smith was a white guy after all. Why should we pay attention to him? That's some of about the level of intellectual discourse in some of the more politically correct universities. And so fascism was basically was a variety of socialism, and the Nazis, and Mussolini's Italy were basically socialist countries. Hayek pointed out in the Road to Serfdom that in Germany they nationalized the Nazis did about half of all industry, and then the other half was so heavily regimented and controlled and regulated that it was de facto nationalized. And that's probably the big difference between Soviet socialism and the German and the Nazi socialism, is that fascism allowed a degree of private ownership, but it was heavily controlled and dictated, what it would do would be dictated by the government, by the state. So ownership was not really private ownership, since the state controlled everything. And that is why our old friend Bob Higgs, author of the great book Crisis in Leviathan, calls the American economy today participatory fascism. He says businesses are so heavily regulated and controlled that it's like fascism was, but at least they let us vote once in a while. And so it's participatory. But Mussolini was a dictator, of course, and Hitler was a dictator, so he couldn't vote. But I guess our fascism, Bob Higgs would say, is slightly better than the Nazis and Mussolini because it's participatory. And so that's a trick politicians always play, isn't it? They want us to think that they're legitimate because, after all, we voted, which is why I never vote. One of my old essays on LouRockwell.com is entitled "Be Patriotic, Don't Vote." Okay, so that's point number 5, I guess. Point number 6 is that inequality historically is far worse under socialism than under capitalism. If you read about Venezuela today, for example, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that said Hugo Chavez's daughter, who's in her 30s, has a net worth of about $4 billion. And as far as I know, she never started a business. I don't think she's one of the original founders of Microsoft or anything like that. And $4 billion. And the Wall Street Journal also said that the former finance minister of Venezuela, who I think they said he now lives in Switzerland, had a net worth of $11 billion. Okay, and of course, even to this day, you can read articles in the American news media about the political elite in Venezuela still living high on the hog. They have their country clubs and they have their food, and you also read about people killing dogs and cats to feed their children. The ordinary people in Venezuela. And it's always been like that. The people who ran the Soviet Union had multiple vacation homes all over the place and accumulated great wealth, and the masses were equally indigent. And country after country, you see that. The African potentates who adopted socialism and became dictators after independence in the 1960s, they all lived like kings and queens, and while the people starved. And so the whole business of we need socialism to create more equality is fraudulent. It's never been true. Never been true like that. Not that equality is even a desirable thing, because of course we're all different. We're all different in thousands of different ways. And the only way you can move in the direction of trying to force equality is with a totalitarian society. And of course, you can never do that. You can never have equality because human beings are not equal. As Rabbi Daniel Lapin, who gave a talk here some years ago on this point, he said that he made the point that God made all human beings. This is a Jewish rabbi. He said God made all human beings unique, just like he made all stones unique. Stones are all different. Every stone is different. You can't find two stones that are the same. But humans can make bricks identical. We can manufacture bricks, like the bricks in a house or a building. You can make those identical. And he posed the question, do you want to think of yourself more as a stone or a brick? And that's what egalitarianism is about, is making us all into identical bricks, even if it kills us. And where's my list of mass murder there? That's always been the idea, even if it kills us. Okay. Point number 7: the income tax is the essence of socialism. The income, especially the progressive income tax. This is why in the Communist Manifesto, there's a 10-point plank of the Communist Manifesto, 10 points. Point number 1 says abolition of private property. Point number 2 is a heavy progressive income tax. Okay. Now, of course, economists, the Austrians and others have studied the income tax. It increases the rate of time preference and destroys the work effort and has all these bad effects. But it has another effect as well. And I want to read a short quote about that from Frank Chodoroff. One of the great books ever written on the income tax is The Income Tax, Root of All Evil by Frank Chodoroff, which is for sale downstairs at the bookstore, I noticed this morning. And here's something he said. He said, when the progressive income tax was adopted in 1913, this is in the United States, the absolute right of private property in the United States was violated. That, of course, is the essence of socialism. Whatever else socialism is, or is claimed to be, its first tenet is the denial of private property. Well, it's in the Communist Manifesto. This is why all socialists, beginning with Karl Marx, have advocated income taxation, the heavier the better. And so that's certainly very true. And also, to have socialism, so, the socialists of the world always want a centralized governmental power. They can't allow divided sovereignty or federalism or states' rights, whatever you want to call it, devolution of power. They want centralized power. And nothing, in the United States history anyway, nothing gave us centralized governmental bureaucracy more than the income tax and the Fed. And they both happened in the same year, in 1913. And so the socialists of the world knew what they were doing, and they know what they were doing when they're so worshipful about the income tax, because it centralizes power, and it basically tells you that you don't own the income that you earn. The government owns all of your income. You are a slave to the government, and the government will tell you how much of your income you are allowed to keep by setting the tax rates. It's our income, and we will tell you how much you get to keep. And so Charteroff, I think, was right on the money when he wrote that. And the only reason they don't, of course, make the rates even higher, they always try to maximize the rates, is they do understand that we will cheat on our taxes, and we will stop working, and we might even have an armed revolution if they steal, if they make us destitute by confiscating too much of our income. So even the people who are on my sleazometer have to be careful about that, because as Rothbard wrote in quite a few places, and it reminded us that any state in the world is greatly outnumbered by millions and millions of people. And so any state is always just a relatively small group of people. And so they always run the risk of a revolution or a violent revolution. That's why they spend so many resources on propaganda and indoctrination. It's sort of a way to quell revolutionary impulses on the cheap. They don't always use violence to put down revolutions. The indoctrination and propaganda is also a tool that is very essential there. Okay. Point number 8. The Scandinavian countries are about as socialist as the United States is. One of the myths out there that Crazy Bernie has been spreading is that we need to be more like Sweden. We need to be more like Denmark. These Scandinavian countries, they're more socialist, democratic socialism. He says there's a huge difference between socialism and democratic socialism, and he usually spells huge with about 15 or 20 U's in it when you see him on television doing that. But take a look at this. This is there's something called the Index of Economic Freedom. It's published by several different groups. The Fraser Institute in Canada publishes one. Fraser.org, Fraser.org. The Heritage Foundation publishes one. This is one from the Heritage Foundation. They put together an index of economic freedom. Basically, every country in the world is ranked, and if the more, in their opinion, that you safeguard private property, the rule of law, minimal government, minimal regulations, lower taxes, you get a higher rating. And so they come up with an index number for every country. And this is the latest rankings here. The US ranking is, I think the United States is 12th. And the index number is 76.8. Denmark is 76.7. So we're about as socialist as Denmark. Sweden and Finland, pretty close, pretty much the same. So we're pretty much, they're hardly, can be said to be more socialist than the United States. The top ranking goes to Hong Kong, 90.2, just to give you an idea of how far away the U.S. and the Scandinavian countries are. Singapore, 89.2. I think what Crazy Bernie is referring to is Sweden in the 1950s. In the 1940s, the Swedes became sort of infatuated with fascist planning, And then fascism kind of got a bad name after the Hitler thing. And so they ditched that, but they sort of adopted their own version of socialism. They nationalized a lot of industries, very heavy taxes, big welfare state. And according to the Swedish Academy of Economics, Sweden did not create a single net new job from 1950 until 2005. So for 55 years, there was zero job growth in Sweden. And Sweden produced, let me get the statistic here. They did the same thing these other countries did. They tried to inflate their way out of the mess they had created. And in the 1980s, they had 500% interest rates in Sweden. And that's when the Swedish government began to retrench. They privatized a lot of their industries, including a big part of healthcare, and moved in the other direction. So that's why today they're pretty close to the United States in terms of their ranking. But they pretty much destroyed. They did exactly what Mises said about destructionism. They lived off the past efforts and investments and sacrifices of the great Swedish capitalists of the late 19th and early 20th century that produced a lot of great things for the world, and then ruined it, basically. Okay, so the Sweden, Denmark, Finland, they have private enterprise. These are still primarily capitalist countries with a big welfare state, just like the United States. We are still primarily a capitalist country. We have private enterprises, but we have a much bigger welfare state than the Scandinavian countries do. And so it doesn't make sense to say we need to be more like them, more socialistic. We already are. We already are. Point number 9, running out of time here. Socialism has caused the worst pollution problems in the history of the world, at least the modern history of the world. After the collapse of communism in the late 80s and early 90s, all of a sudden, all these closed totalitarian societies opened up, and people could look around and learn a lot of things, including the state of the environment over there. Now, at the time, any student who had studied economics was taught that the root cause of pollution is unregulated free market competition. The story that you're all told is that industrialists will take into consideration the private costs to them. They have to pay wages and they have to pay for raw materials, but they won't take into consideration the external cost in terms of the pollution and the damage it might cause to your health or to your property or something like that. And therefore, they will produce too much, and the government needs to step in and regulate and control production to do that. Well, if that theory is true, then what would you expect the environment to look like in countries that outlawed the pursuit of profit for 50, 60, 70 years? If the pursuit of profit is the root cause of pollution, and then you have a society that outlaws the pursuit of profit, the legal pursuit of profit, for half a century, what would you expect the environment to look like in those countries? You expect it to be pristine, after all, if that's the root cause. Well, the exact opposite turned out to be the truth. And there were even books published with titles like Ecocide in the USSR. And this is true not just in the Soviet Union and under communism, but Venezuela, Venezuela today, Lake Maracaibo, I'm not sure that's how you pronounce it. Hundreds of tons of untreated sewage flow into it every day. When British Petroleum had that awful accident in the Gulf of Mexico, an oil platform caught on fire, people died, they immediately set aside $20 billion to pay compensation because they knew they were going to have to pay compensation. Well, Mexico, the government of Mexico, their oil platforms catch on fire all the time. And this is the government-run business. And whenever that happens, they deny any liability. They even denied that there was an oil slick. There was one about 7 or 8 years ago, and they denied that there was any kind of oil slick or environmental damage. And then Greenpeace took a satellite image of the oil slick that was created by the Mexican government's oil platform. And so so you have a situation there where the capitalists took responsibility for the horrible accident, And then when the Mexican government has an almost identical horrible accident, I don't think anybody, certainly nobody wanted this to happen. They deny being liable at all. And so if you look at the history of what happened in the socialist countries, they ruined their environments far more than anything we've seen in the United States. In Russia, the Volga River, the steamboats had signs on them saying, "Don't throw cigarettes overboard, the river may catch on fire." They almost wiped out the sturgeon population. In Poland, people with lung disease were sent to underground uranium mines as health clinics. The fire trucks would have to go through the streets several times a day in the industrial part of Poland, knocking the lead dust out of the air from the factories. I have an old friend who grew up in former Yugoslavia, and he worked for the government, so he was a government lawyer. Ivan Pongrasic, some of you, the old timers here, know who he was. His son is an Austrian School economist, and they both were. But anyway, he came to this country, but he told me once he lived in a 30th floor apartment in Zagreb, and I asked him, why 30th floor? And he said, there's no elevator in the building. And I said, what, are you a mountain climber, or what's, what, a physical fitness fanatic? What is it? He said, no, the pollution is so bad that you can't, if you're below the 20th floor, you can't open your windows because you'll die from the lead and cadmium and zinc dust that comes in your house all day long. Can't do that. And so it was pretty awful, and under socialism. And so I have a whole chapter on that, so you can read the book. I guess the final thing I'll say is welfare harms the poor, and I'm running out of time. So socialist welfare harms the poor. So I'm going to read you one thing about. And there's a lot of literature about how the welfare destroys work incentives, causes family breakup, and so forth. And I'm going to read one thing about what an extreme welfare state in Sweden has done to the Swedish people. And this is from our friend Per Byland, who's an Austrian School economist. He's lectured here many times. He's a friend of ours. He's a Swede, but he works, I think he's at Oklahoma State University now. He said this, I'm quoting Per, "When handling out benefits and therefore taking away the individual's responsibility for his or her own life, a new kind of individual is created, the immature, irresponsible, and dependent. The welfare state has created a population of psychological and moral children. The children and grandchildren of the welfare state are indoctrinated at an early age in the government schools that they have a supposed right to free education, health care, and income, and anything else they might desire." And of course, when you say that, that means somebody else has the obligation to be your slave, to work for you. And my old friend Walter Williams, when he gives one of his canned speeches, I've had him in my university several times, he kind of shocks some of the students by asking them this question. He says, what would you call a system in which one person is forced with the threats of imprisonment, kidnapping and imprisonment, to work for the benefit of another person? And it usually takes about 5 seconds for someone to say what? What would you say? Slavery, yeah. And then, of course, he describes the welfare state. And what else would you call that when the average American works until May now to pay taxes, mostly for the benefit of other people? What would you call that? And that's what the welfare state has done. And I think I have about 1 minute left if we have a question or two, or anything, any brilliant declarations or anything like that.
So on the fascism as socialism, what would you say to the people who declare, well, they had private property, they were somewhat capitalist?
Well, there wasn't. They went along with it. Hayek criticized the German capitalists who themselves went along with this, and they kept their property, but they were happy to keep their property, but then they were regimented and regulated by the government. But that's not real private property. That's not real. Are you a free man if everything you do, your schedule every day is determined by me, I have to tell you where to go, what job you're going to have, how long you have to stay at work, and so forth, and how to do your job, you're not a free man in that sense. And so if you have a slave master called the state, you're not a free man. And if you have a slave master as a business person, you're not a genuinely private enterprise either. And that's basically what fascism was. One more question, I guess we're almost out of time here.
And what about socialism and culture? What some people call cultural Marxism? Because these are mostly economic arguments.
Yes.
For some Latin America, there isn't that much talk about economic socialism because we have Venezuela as an example. But there are a lot of movements who actually do things to promote what's so-called cultural Marxism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the brand of Marxism that infects the United States today too. But we do still have people who are making the case for economic socialism. It's still, you can't separate the two, really. The history of this, I wrote a little essay. It's on LouRockwell.com called "Misesian Destructionism Then and Now," and I summarized some of this. But the cultural Marxists, these were European immigrants, came to America and became extremely influential. Their ideas totally dominate American universities now, and probably in your country as well. And what they said was that these were all people who tried to bring Marxian socialism to Europe, and they failed. The people did not go for Marxian socialism in Europe. It was imposed on Eastern Europe after the war, but the people themselves did not want that. And they decided the reason for that was the institutions of Western civilization, like I said earlier, had free market economics, the ideas of liberalism, constitutionalism, democracy, all these things. The people did not want to give that up. And also Christianity. If God is your sovereign, then some politician cannot be your sovereign. God is your sovereign. They didn't want that. They wanted themselves to be your sovereign and to order you around. And that's how else could they achieve socialist utopia? And so they said very clearly in their writings that their objective would be to destroy Christianity and to destroy the institutions of Western civilization. And that's what political correctness is all about. That's what cultural Marxism is all about. That's what's going on. All the attacks on the traditional family, especially the traditional family. One of these characters was a Hungarian, Lukács, and when his party got into control in Hungary, this is the early 20th century, he was some sort of, I think they made him a minister of culture, and he started advocating all sorts of, wife swapping and all sorts of, anything to destroy the traditional family, and they were kicked out. They were the Hungarians said, "Get out of here." They didn't want that, and so, and this is one of the people now who is like one of the leading intellectual lights of cultural Marxism, even though he's long dead. And so, these are the people whose ideas have been embraced by the American left in academia, and they totally have taken over, like in your country. But it's connected to economic socialism, because their objective is they want a centrally planned totalitarian society, but they have to get rid of these institutions first that keep the existing society together. Destructionism. So it's all about destructionism that I opened my talk with. That's what cultural Marxism is. It's about destroying these existing institutions. And Marxists have always been they've always been about destructionism, even if they have no idea what will come next. They just want to destroy what is. And then, we'll worry about that later. It's kind of like when Nancy Pelosi said, pass the Obama law and we'll figure out what it says later. That's a classic example of how the Marxists have always thought about these things. And I guess my time is up, and coffee break time. Thank you.
Anything about Gramsci's and Christian
Yeah.
change it to 2019.
Yeah.
No problem. I got it.
Thanks. So I better what? I plan to use the N word in my life.
We'll have the delete button ready soon. YouTube would ban us instantly. There we go. 2019.
And so again, they see which one, they see this one.
No. They see this one.
They see this one.
Here, I can make it a little easier.
Yeah. Okay. So they see what I see. Oh, great.
Here, I'll change it to.
Yeah.
There we go.
Oh, great.
Now, so that's exactly.
So then you should listen to that.
The worst.
Sit.
Your watches are muted right now. All right, you're all set. So.
Well, I'll see if I can come up with one or two.
Really close to that mic and project.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everybody. I think we'll get started now. During the lecture in the last period, Tom DiLorenzo told us 10 things that are wrong with socialism. I'm expecting that at the end of my talk, you'll be able to give 10 things that are wrong with my lecture. That much easier to come up with more than that, but you don't want to make it too demanding. Now, I'm going to be talking about Mises and Rothbard on ethics. Ethics is a very important subject. There's some people who don't care for ethics at all. One recalls in one of the novels of the great British humorist P.G. Wodehouse, a character says to Jeeves, "Whenever anything comes up, I always ask myself one question: what's in it for me?" I think if you hold that view, you probably won't find this lecture of all that much interest. Now, if we look at the Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, we find that they have very similar views about policy, especially economic policy. Both Mises and Rothbard support the free market, oppose socialism and government intervention in the economy. Now, there are differences about property rights. I'll get into that later. The main difference between Mises and Rothbard, aside, of course, from the minarchism issue, concerns foundations of ethics. Rothbard, in contrast to Mises, thought that ethics is objective. If we say, for example, that we ought to promote the free market, this tells us what we ought morally to do. It isn't only that this isn't only a claim about how we can realize the preferences for peace and prosperity that people in fact have. Mises said, well, everybody, or practically everybody, wants peace and prosperity. Those who don't will tend to die out, so we'll have left those who want peace and prosperity. And if we want that, then we should institute the free market. So this is a claim it's a hypothetical claim. It's if we want this, we should have the free market. In fact, we do want this, so then we should have the free market. You have if A, then B, but A, therefore B. It's hypothetical. So it doesn't say that we ought to value peace and prosperity. It's just that we do value peace and prosperity. So many people along similar lines argue in this way. They say, well, we could imagine, Henry Hazlitt is one who argues this way, he says, the ideal state of affairs for everybody might be one where everybody could do whatever he wanted. You could just, anything you like would be all right, but we realize if everybody had that preference, we wouldn't be able to get much of what we wanted. We would just be fighting and be in conflict with each other. So it's to our advantage to establish certain social institutions and limit our trying to get what we want. So we restrict each other. So morality, on this view, is a device or an institution. It's not that we get together and decide on this, but it's as if we had decided on this. We can use this as an explanatory hypothesis to explain morality. Morality is a system of instituted, people are trained to follow certain customs, and the result of this is that people will get more of what they want, at least in the long term, more than if they just acted as they immediately wanted to do. So in this view, morality is an institution or a device, but in the Rothbardian view, where morality is objective, morality isn't invented. It's discovered rather than invented. It's not that we just discover that certain rules will be in our interests. We're discovering objective truths about the world. What do we mean when we say, we're asking the question, is ethics objective? What do we mean by this? This is one of the most important topics in contemporary ethics. As most philosophers understand this question, when we say, what do we mean when we say morality is objective? Are moral judgments true or false that are in a way that's not dependent on us or our opinions? To answer no would be to accept subjectivism. Suppose, as is in fact the case, that I like vanilla ice cream, but you don't. So in a subjectivist view, neither of us is correct or incorrect. We would just have different views on what we liked. So a subjectivist would claim morality is like this. We just have different tastes, as it were. Some people like one thing, other people like other things. It can turn out that a lot of people or most people like the same thing, but the preference is just subjective in the sense it's dependent on people's tastes. If we say morality is objective, we would be claiming that moral judgments are true regardless of what people think about them. Just as we say we're now at the von Mises Institute, that's a matter of fact. It's not dependent on your thinking you're at the Mises Institute. You could all be thinking you're somewhere else, or wishing that I were somewhere else. But so here, if you say morality is objective, you're claiming there are matters of fact about morality. I'll just say as a matter of interest, there's some people who just find this notion incomprehensible. For example, there was a book that came out recently. I did a brief review of it. It was by Patricia Churchland, who's a well-known philosopher at the University of San Diego. She was commenting on the view that Tom Nagel has, that morality is objective in the sense I've been explaining. She said she just can't understand how anyone could say this once you give an evolutionary account showing how certain moral reactions develop. How could there possibly be anything more to say about it? She just found this view totally incomprehensible. So there are people who think that way. Of course, she's also what's called an eliminativist. She doesn't think there, at least at one point in her career, she didn't think people had any beliefs at all. So I guess one might want to know, does she really believe that this view is incomprehensible? But I'll leave that question to her to answer. I'm sure if I asked her, I'm sure she'd ignore my email. She would just dismiss it as hate mail, and she would be right. Now, I think it's important to see exactly what the issue is between Mises and Rothbard about objectivity. Mises certainly thinks that many judgments that have something to do with ethics are true or false. For example, suppose you say the free market enables people to obtain their preferences, or at least certain preferences, those that can be satisfied by producers who are trying to give people what they want to buy. So Mises would certainly say that's objectively true in the sense that, just a matter of fact, it's not dependent on people's opinions that the free market works. It's just a law of social science that this is the case. But according to Mises, ultimate value judgments are not true or false. Suppose, for example, somebody doesn't want to be in pain, and this isn't a means to some further end. It isn't that you say, well, I don't want to be in pain because that's preventing me or impeding me from doing some work that I have to get out, and I'm concentrating on my headache now, so I can't do the work. So this, if you said that, then that might very well be something that's capable of being true or false, that maybe the headache really is making you feel, preventing you from working. But if you just had felt you don't want the pain anymore, that's it. That, for Mises, would be an ultimate preference, ultimate value judgment. If you said pain is bad, that's just probably most people would agree with that. I suppose there are some who wouldn't. You know, the old, like there are masochists who might reject that, but most people would accept that. So according to Mises, that would just be, there's no more you could say about that. That's a preference that people have. That's it. But Rothbard would disagree with that. He thinks that their value judgments are objective in the sense that judgments about facts are true or false. That's not to say that Rothbard doesn't give any place for judgments that are simply preferences. I mean, Rothbard wouldn't say, at least I don't think he would, I never asked him this, that if you like a particular kind of ice cream, there's some objective matter of fact about whether your preference is correct. But he would say that there are value judgments that are not means to some further ends that are straightforwardly true or false. So this is the point at issue between them. Now, how can Rothbard show that ethics is objective in the sense that it's appealing, it claims that certain ultimate value judgments are straightforwardly true or false? Rothbard does this by appealing to natural law, especially as developed by St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher and theologian of the Middle Ages. Rothbard, in his philosophical views, was generally a Thomist, although he wasn't a theist. But it does remind me of one philosopher who said he was interested in Thomas Aquinas, but he was no more than a peeping Thomist. Now, there is I see some people are just getting the joke now. Sometimes these take a while, but we have time. All right, so there is a problem here. Aquinas was as I mentioned, was a Catholic theologian who argued that natural law is part of divine law. So the question comes up, does accepting natural law commit you to accepting the claims of a particular religion, or if not that, at least philosophical claims about God? In that, so according to Rothbard, and here he has some support in Aquinas himself, considerable support in Aquinas himself, that even though Aquinas thought that natural law was part of God's law, arriving at the truths of natural law depended only on human reason. It didn't require accepting biblical revelation. Of course, it doesn't exclude that, but according to Aquinas and Rothbard followed, it doesn't require that you accept biblical or other revelation. It would be just discoverable by reason. Now this is disputed. This is if you're interested in Thomistic ethics, this is a big topic in dispute. It's a big topic in dispute even if you're not interested in Thomistic ethics. It in fact is a big topic in dispute. But it's clear that I think it's quite clear that Aquinas held this view, because if you look at his, he wrote in addition to the Summa Theologica, he wrote Summa Contra Gentiles, which is apologetic work for those who don't accept Christianity. It's a defense. So he says, well, there are some people who accept Christianity, some people who just believe in God but are not Christian, some people don't believe in God at all. And he thought we can show by reason some things to the people who don't believe in God at all. So Aquinas, even though he was a Catholic theologian, thought we could establish certain things just by reasoning about him. There's a famous quotation by the great Dutch legal theorist Hugo Grotius, who was also a theologian, not a Catholic. He was what's called an Arminian. He was a Protestant, sort of a critic of certain kinds of Calvinism, called Arminian. So he had a famous sentence. He said, "What we have been saying would have a degree of validity even if we should concede that which cannot be conceded without the utmost wickedness. There is no God, or the affairs of men are of no concern to him." So the claim there would be, we can show that natural law is true just by reason. And Suarez said something about this. Now, there's an interesting, I won't go into details about this, there's an interesting logical problem with the statement by Grotius. If you hold that God exists necessarily, it's a necessary truth that God exists, then on the supposition that he's giving, we would have a necessary truth, God doesn't exist, and there's a necessary truth that's false. If you put that, if you have a necessary falsehood in your system, then you're going to get into a whole lot of logical trouble. So maybe Grotius shouldn't have worded his claim this way. He should have just said we could establish certain truths about ethics just by reasoning about it. If you didn't get that, don't worry about it. I'm not going to worry about it. But it is an interesting logical point, though, I think. Now, Rothbard draws an interesting parallel between divine command ethics and positivism. For those of you who are in Judge Napolitano's class, you remember legal positivism is the view that law is just the command of the legislator. So something is law just because the legislator says it is law. It doesn't have to meet any requirements of natural law or anything else. It's just this is commanded. So according to divine command ethics, at least in certain versions of divine command ethics has no basis in reason. Ethical rules are just commands of God. I should say there are versions, more sophisticated versions of divine command ethics of which this claim isn't right, but I'm not going to go into that right now, much as I'd like to. It's not relevant for this lecture, and I digress enough in my lectures as it is. You know, we don't want to overdo it. But here, the legal positivist, we could say, well, if God commands something, we could at least say we have good reason to do it because God is an omniscient and omnipotent, all-good being. So if he commands something, we have good reason to do it. But here, the legal positivist would be arrogating to himself the divine prerogatives and acting as if he were able to tell us what to do, as if he had divine capacities that just his command could make something right. So Rothbard says, no, this isn't true in law, it isn't true in ethics. There's a matter of fact about what's right that can be established by reason. Now, how does natural law show that ethical judgments are objective? Rothbard appeals to essences. What do I mean by this? Well, an object properties can be divided into two classes. One class are the essential properties, characteristics of the object. The object wouldn't be that object unless it had those properties. For example, it's the essence of water to be composed of hydrogen and oxygen. nothing that isn't consists of hydrogen and oxygen would be water. And the rest of the properties of the object are non-essential. So we have for any object, or at least most objects, they're essential properties. Now, the followers of Ayn Rand carry this view to an extreme. They think that every property of the object is essential. That's a rather strange view, but that they hold that. So for them, if anything about an object were different, it wouldn't be that object. All the properties are essential, but that isn't the standard view in Aristotle or in Thomas Aquinas. So what Rothbard, again, in the standard Thomist and Aristotelian way, thinks we can determine the essence of human beings just as we can for other things. But here there is an objection. Somebody might say, well, suppose Rothbard's right, we could determine what are the essential, what is the essence of a human being in an analogous way. It's the way chemists can say the essence of water is to be composed of hydrogen and oxygen mixed in a certain way. If somebody said that, wouldn't this be just be part of anthropology, not ethics? How would an account of the human essence tell us what we should do? It would just be saying, this is what human beings are, but that leaves open the question, what human beings should be. Rothbard answers these questions by appealing to the concept of flourishing or happiness. If you want to flourish, you need to do certain things, and what those things are dictated by human nature. Now, so far, as you will, I'm sure, have noticed, this is parallel to Mises. It just says, if you want to flourish, you should do such and such. So this is like Mises' claim, if you want peace and prosperity, you should favor the free market. So the question would come up, well, is there really any difference between Mises and Rothbard? Have I been wasting your time devoting all this attention to suppose going into all this material about essences? Is this, do they all come down, do they all just come down to the same conclusion with Rothbard, just putting in a little different philosophical terminology? But here is the crux of the matter, is that Rothbard doesn't take human flourishing as a mere hypothetical. In the natural law, it's objectively true, this is a good, you should want to flourish. If you, for some reason, said, I just don't want to flourish, I don't care about happiness, you would be wrong about it, in the same way that somebody would say, confused H2O with H2SO4 would be wrong also. That would probably, it would be probably more easy to show that the second person was wrong fairly quickly. So Rothbard here rejects what some people call Hume's law, which is that no ought judgment follows from is judgments. If you have just statements of what is the case, you can't deduce what ought to be the case. So Rothbard argues that from the fact that certain things are needed for human beings to flourish, it follows that we ought to want those things. And if you don't want them, you should. Again, but then the question, this seems like an odd thing to say, how is it supposed to follow from the fact that we need to do certain things to flourish, that we unconditionally ought to do those things? Most people certainly want to flourish, but what if somebody didn't? What would be the point of saying to this person, well, you ought to, whether you want to or not? Again, suppose you just said, if you want to flourish, you should do that. That would be Mises' position and also Ayn Rand's position, but it isn't standard natural law theory. Again, according to natural law theory, and I'm going over this a number of times because it is at first a rather counterintuitive view to many people, especially those people who've been corrupted by too many courses in economics. In standard natural law theory, what you ought to do isn't dependent on your choosing something. You simply ought to do it. So it's not the view that if you, as Ayn Rand says, if you choose to live, you should do such and such, where the choice is up to you. In the standard natural law theory, if you said, I don't want to live, that would be wrong. You would be choosing something that's objectively wrong. So how do we get these non-hypothetical odds? Now, would be one thing I just thought of. I could just say, I haven't the slightest idea, and then finish the lecture. But I don't think that would be a good way to do things. It would also be a false claim. So I'm not going to do that. Not that I'm above making false claims from time to time. Now, Rothbard notes that living things have certain tendencies. For example, a normal colt will develop into a horse, and a colt that failed to do this would be defective. So we could say a good horse is one that develops normally. And in this view, an animal should develop according to its tendencies. That's just what should means, that it should, an organism should develop normally, ought to develop normally. Things ought to fulfill this essence. Their essences, this is just on this Aristotelian view, what we mean by ought. It's the way really you get an ought from an is that the characterization of ought is just fulfilling your normal or natural tendencies. So you're not making any logical leap, you're just giving the consequences of following that definition. So on this view, if you didn't want to flourish, you would be abnormal, you would be going against your natural tendencies, so you would be not wanting what you ought to want. There's a famous objection to arguments of this sort, which is called the open question objection. And this was famously given by G.E. Moore. You remember I talked about him in my first lecture on praxeology, where Moore was the one who said there are certain facts that are obvious, that are just, we know these intuitively. This is the same person, G. Moore. He made famous contributions in a lot of different areas. So he said, well, suppose you say ought means, suppose you ask the question, ought we to do what we need to flourish? should we do what we need to flourish? This question seems to make sense. We can ask, we want to say, what are the reasons that we ought to want this, or why maybe we shouldn't want this? It seems to make sense, and people, in fact, argue about this. But if ought just means what we need to do to flourish, the question wouldn't make sense. It would be something like saying, ought we to do what we ought to do? It would just be a tautology. So Moore said, just from the fact that we can ask the question and have it make sense, or at least seems to make sense, that shows that ought doesn't mean what we need to do to flourish. But Rothbard could just reply to that if we think the question makes sense, we're mistaken. So the argument, the objection here is really assuming what the point in controversy. I should say there are more technical ways to answer the open question argument, but again, fortunately for you, I'm not going to go into those in this lecture. My lecture is confusing enough as it is. Why make things worse? They're bad enough already. Now, Rothbard says that political philosophy is just concerned with part of ethics. It's confined to delimiting the permissible use of force and threats of force. So ethical issues that don't involve force aren't covered in political philosophy. Political philosophy is just confined to this one sphere. And this separation between political philosophy and other parts of ethics comes from John Locke, the great British philosopher of the 17th century. And the 19th century German philosopher Fichte, who is not generally regarded as a libertarian, although he was at a certain stage of his career, he had strong libertarian tendencies, also stressed this notion of a separation of political philosophy from the rest of ethics. So political philosophy just concerned with permissible use of force. So one point also very important in Rothbard's view of trying to determine what we need to flourish, here he's quite a bit in contrast with Henry Hazlitt and Friedrich Hayek. He's suspicious of the role of custom and common law if they're just taken purely by themselves. He says we have to test them by reason, and he doesn't accord them a presumption of truth, although in certain areas he did. He did like the English common law tradition, and he did place some emphasis on that, but he said we always have to examine this by reason. Now, Rothbard thinks in order to flourish, each person needs to be a self-owner, meaning each person has the right to decide what to do with his or her own body. I mean, supposing, let's say, somebody needs a kidney, the person needs to have a kidney transplant in order to live, and as it happens, you're a match for this person. So if the person doesn't get the kidney, then he's going to die, but you, after all, can get along with just one kidney. You might have certain problems, but the other person needs this in order to live. It's up to you whether you want to donate the kidney to the other person. it isn't, you can't be forced to do that. Of course, for me, it wouldn't be a question. I'd just say absolutely not. That would be foolish. I would agree more with the character in the Woodhouse novel I quoted at the start of the lecture. But that, like many things in this lecture, is beside the point. So it's up. It isn't. I should say, it isn't. The notion of self-ownership isn't a philosophically problematic concept, contrary to what some people think. Again, all it means is that each person should be in control of certain decisions about his own body, such as the kidney example or blood transfusion example I just mentioned. Now, I should say also, self-ownership does not imply, as some people wrongly think, that the mind is separate from the body and owns it. You're not making, when you talk about self-ownership, you're not making any assumptions about the mind-body relation. So self in self-ownership is what we call reflexive. Suppose you say, for example, somebody lacks self-esteem. We don't mean that the person's self lacks esteem for something else, namely the person's body. We just mean he doesn't regard himself very highly. So in the same way, a self-owner controls certain aspects of himself. It isn't that we're taking the self as something separate. Now, some people object to this and they say, well, that isn't real ownership, because real ownership must involve a separation between the owner and what's owned. I must say I find this an odd objection, because even though I've argued before that in the Aristotelian view there are essences, ownership isn't a thing in the world, it's just a term invented for our convenience. It doesn't have an essence, we can define it as we please. So if you don't like the term self-ownership, feel free to use some other term. Nothing turns on what word we use, but some people really will make a big fuss about this. Oh, you know, you can't talk about self-ownership. This is illegitimate, but they're wrong about that. Take it from me. If you say that, if you give this view on the oral exam, the one I objected to, you won't do well, I guarantee it. So I'll just say we're running out of time, but how does Rothbard make the claim for self-ownership? He does it in certain way by contrasting self-ownership with other systems. Like we could have, suppose imagine a system where some people own others, where there's slavery. So Rothbard says, well, isn't it obvious slavery is wrong? So here he's, at least at this point, he's somewhat of a moral intuitionist, someone who thinks we can grasp the truth about some moral claims. For example, suppose we say it's wrong to kill babies for fun. And somebody said, well, how do we know that? Why is that true? I think we would say that person is missing the point. It isn't true owing to certain its truth isn't dependent on accepting a particular theory or certain reasons. It just is true. So after he establishes self-ownership, Rothbard then develops an account of how people acquire property, where he says land and other resources start out unowned, and people own their own labor, and when they mix their labor with the unowned land in an appropriate way, they acquire the land, and property rights leave no room for a legitimate state. Now, on the last point, I see we're out of running out of time. So I'll just conclude with interesting point that's often missed, that how Mises differs with Rothbard on property rights. Mises thinks we need a legal system where people have stable property rights because this is essential to how the free market works. But it doesn't follow that for Mises, these rights have to be acquired through homesteading. Any stable system of property rights will do. So Mises, in fact, is an opponent of traditional natural law theory, and he rejects labor, these kind of Lockean appropriation views. This just isn't his way of doing things. You could certainly accept what Mises says about the benefits of the free market and still accept this Lockean view of ownership, but that isn't the way Mises does it. I remember there was someone who used to work at the Mises Institute who was trying to insist, no, Mises does accept these the same views on of property as Rothbard does, because those would be the ones supported by utilitarian theory. But that view isn't right. I don't think it's a coincidence that person isn't with the Mises Institute anymore, but I don't claim responsibility for that. So, all right, well, we're out of time now, so thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, yeah.
The idea that self-ownership isn't real.
was told to go a little late, so. Okay, thank you everyone for attending. So I want to thank everyone for making it this far in Mises U. So it's Wednesday, you're at the halfway point. So this is now when all of the lectures will become good and challenging. So I'm here to talk about a project I've been working on for a long time. And it's with great honor that I've been involved in the project. And it is Conceived in Liberty, Volume 5. The New Republic, 1784 to 1791, okay? So this is another book by, I should have put Murray Rothbard there, is another book by Murray Rothbard that I'll be talking about. So we'll really be discussing in this presentation two things. So it's talking about the Conceived in Liberty series as a whole, which was one of the many projects Murray Rothbard worked on, his series on early American history. And we'll talk about how it initially grew out of his American history project and how it's something that he was working on throughout most of his career. And then I'll be going through the overview of the 5th volume of Conceived in Liberty, which is the New Republic. And this primarily deals with the U.S. Constitution, okay? So we'll be talking about the Articles of Confederation, the Constitutional Convention, the ratification debates over the Constitution, as well as the significance of the U.S. Constitution. So this Mises U with Judge Napolitano's classes on the Constitution. Now this will be very Constitution-heavy Mises U. So when I go through the overview of the 5th volume, I'm going to try and, I won't be able to go through everything, only be able to touch the main points. And I'm going to try and do a good enough job that you're interested enough to buy the book. If I explain it too well, then you're going to say, oh, I don't need to buy the book because he does everything, he talks about everything in the presentation. So here, I just have to be just mediocre enough, basically, to sort of whet your appetite, and I think I'm perfectly suited for the task. All right, so, another Rothbard book, yes. Rothbard, in all of his Conceived in Liberty books, in his prefaces, he started off with, he says, what, another American history book? The reader may be pardoned for the seemingly inexhaustible supply of history books. In this, you'd say, another Murray Rothbard book. The reader may be pardoned for wondering, how there's another Rothbard book. He's been dead, and they keep coming out. But yes, I'm here to tell you that there is another Rothbard book, and is another completed Rothbard book. So here is the Conceived in Liberty series as a whole. Volumes 1 through 4, which form the original series, came out in the 1970s, around the bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence. Volumes 1 and 2 mainly discussed the history of America up to about 1750, the French and Indian War around that time period. Volumes 3 to 4 talk about the path to the revolution, the American Revolutionary War, as well as the American Revolutionary War itself. And then Volume 5, which we'll be discussing the most today, goes through after. So if you'll notice here, the last volume was published in 1979, and the 5th volume will be published in 2019. So, tried to make it so you get the 40-year anniversary, basically, of the 4th volume. So never say never, basically. So, it came out, or it will come out. All right, so let's talk about the history of Rothbard's History of the United States. So what's quite remarkable about the Conceived in Liberty series is that if you ask someone, or what did a prominent academic do in their life, and they say, oh, so-and-so wrote a 5-volume series on early American history. Okay, and then you put a period there, and then maybe they did some book reviews, a couple, papers here and there, but that's an incredible accomplishment. That's the CV, basically. They wrote a 5-volume series on early American history. For Rothbard, in the sense that you could have an entire discussion about all of his accomplishments, and then you could say, oh yeah, he also wrote a 5-volume series on early American history, and then someone goes, wait, what? And then you say, oh yeah, this series it was about 1,800 pages. It was 5 volumes. It was a little thing there, and you go excuse me? And yeah, it's incredible that this was just one of the major projects of his life. He was that talented that prolific of an author that, I mean, this was literally just one side, pursuit that he poured his energy in. So in the 1950s, he was, as hopefully we all know, he was working on Man, Economy, and State with Power and Market, and then America's Great Depression. These two works came out in the early 1960s. So in the 1950s, he worked a lot on economic theory. And then he says, all right, I'm going to switch a little bit. And in the 1960s, just a little bit, he's going to switch to a whole new field of American history, something that it's something he's also very well trained in. He got his PhD from Columbia University, and he wrote a book, his dissertation, The Panic of 1819, which is still very well cited today. Okay, it's hard enough to get someone to read my dissertation that came out like 4 years ago, but you can still look at American history books, and Murray Rothbard's Panic of 1819 is still referenced. So in the 1960s, Rothbard started to work on a American history project. He had a research grant sort of from the mid-1960s. Initially, he thought, all right, it's going to be one volume history. Then it kind of said, all right, the plan is for 2 to 3 volumes, and he sort of broke it up into phases. So the first phase, he said, all right, I'm going to work on early American history, so 1600 to about 1789. It'll take about 1.5 years. Phase 2, the 1800s, he said about 2 years. Then he said phase 3, the 1900s up to the present day, back then, circa 1960, about 1.5 years. Okay, so this is the original outline. So much like he would sort of have a huge treatise on economic theory, Man, Economy, and State, he would similarly have a huge treatise on American history. Okay, so the another major point of this book was that it would be specifically from a libertarian perspective. Okay, in one of his memos that he wrote, and I think this is very important, he said, why was such a libertarian American history book needed? And I think it's still true today. So he wrote this in 1962, and still decades later, his words, they still resonate. So he said, there is perhaps no greater single influence in forming the American mind than its view of American history. While economics, for example, is almost completely confined to specialists into a narrow market at best, works on history, and especially history of the United States, have a far wider and broader market. The student and adult American are, then, shaped by 1, the textbooks used in the scholastic courses, and 2, general interpretative works on American history read by adult laymen and by professional historians as well. So what is he saying here? He's basically saying that your average person, if you want to spread the libertarian message, your average person is going to be most convinced by reading some sort of historical work. Okay, and I know this from my own perspectives. I'm sure many of you do as well. When I first got involved in Austrian economics and libertarianism, the work that I devoured the quickest was, all right, refuting the common perceptions on the Great Depression, the Industrial Revolution, the Civil War, various sorts of events that, again, we already have background knowledge in. Most people take an American history course. If you go to, in high school in America, people have read history, they find it more interesting, it's less technical, etc. So I think it's still true that you need this, because if you want to spread it, you still want to have the overarching sort of libertarian history. Another reason he doesn't say specifically here, but this is even more true today, is he said that, American history books are generally biased in a statist direction. So they're predominantly liberal, in the modern usage of the term, as well as, he says sometimes there's conservative, which really more of like a neoconservative, that every war we've ever fought has been great, and we always needed to fight it, and so on and so forth. And maybe some tax cuts here and there were all good. But aside from that, that's the general perspectives you see. And that's increasingly become true now. So, sort of go on, by the end of 1966, Rothbard had only phase 1 completed. So he had typed drafts of volumes 1 to 4 and a handwritten draft of volume 5. Okay, so this was, the phase 1 was really what became the 5-volume Conceived in Liberty series. And the reasons why he had that, I mean, it's incredible within 5 years, on top of every other things that projects he's working on, he comes out with literally about 1,800 pages of material. Main reason is that there were problems with typing the manuscript. So he initially would handwrite the manuscript, then he would dictate it into a recording machine, and then Joey, his wife, would help him type it out. And he also wanted to devote more time to phase one. He said that there's a lot of things that have gone unmentioned, unnoticed, things like tax rebellions, all sorts of other events. People who are more libertarian than common historians have characterized them, etc. So he says, I've had to devote more time to this, and rightfully so, in my opinion. So he wanted to spend more and more time, and this is a sort of a familiar occurrence with Rothbard's projects. So Man, Economy, and State started out as a textbook on human action. Okay, that was the initial plan. It became this massive treatise. Conceived in Liberty. Been talking about this story. He was talking about the progressive era. It became much longer than he initially envisioned. His history of economic thought. I mean, he was just someone who was so prolific and so intelligent that once you got him to write on something, he would just keep on writing. Basically, he was like the Energizer Bunny. In other words, you just keep going. And Rothbard actually started research on phase two on the 1800s, but he basically had to stop. He even presented some of his findings at a conference with Joseph Dorfman. The research grant ran out, and he had to get a job at Brooklyn Polytechnic. So he became a professor. So this is sort of the general kind of evolution of the project, and this is kind of getting to a major question that I'm sure many of you have in your mind, and saying, okay, so why exactly was the fifth volume never published? Why is it taking 40 years for it to come out? So this is Rothbard. He's discussing this more in a 1972 New Banner interview. He's talking about a lot of the projects he has. So he's discussing For New Liberty. He says, I've got Betrayal of the American Right. I'm working on Ethics of Liberty. And now he says, he's talking about his American History project. He says, in that I've written up to the Constitution. It will be a history of the United States from a libertarian point of view. It is very difficult to write that because the thing is, we don't know what has happened. A lot of the facts have been buried. Orthodox histories don't give many facts. A lot of facts are just left out. The manuscript could be used as a textbook, I hope. Man, Economy, and State was originally supposed to be a textbook and wound up as a giant treatise. I think this might be the same thing, okay? And that, in truth be told, that is what it became. It became a massive treatise on early American history, okay? So always remember to save your work, especially nowadays. So Arlington House published volumes 1 through 4 in time for the bicentennial. And what would happen is, so Rothbard had those typed out and he would edit them, but to make a long story short, the discs for volume 5 were ruined, the recording machine. So it was broke, so only about 60 pages were typed out, and instead you had 500 pages of a handwritten manuscript, okay? So you have about 60 pages and you say, okay, this is good, and then all of a sudden, as you'll see, as I'll show, you have his handwritten pages. And this is in Rothbard's own words. In an interview in 1991, he says, Volume 5 on the Constitution was written in longhand, and no one can read my handwriting. And he is certainly not lying when he says that. He says, no one can read my handwriting. And he sort of has a statement, you wonder, like, oh, you're kind of being hard on yourself. Like, don't say that, but yeah, no, So, you have this, and, this is just a picture you have, and this is, so you can kind of see, we have to be a little bit far out, but, so one, it was written in cursive, so it almost looks like the handwriting from the founding fathers, it's like he's writing the Declaration of Independence Part 2, and he's going on, and even Thomas Jefferson would be like, hey, how do you read this? And, he's got things crossed out, and he's got arrows, and he's got footnote or paragraph, and he writes his ands as pluses, and everyone, that's normal. And then he's got citations, and so basically that was kind of what was there. And so most people would say, who want to start this project, would say, I'll pass. Maybe later. And so it took someone who had nothing else to do, an enormous amount of time on their hand, and really nothing else going on in their life to really sit down and work on the project. And I'm not gonna, that was me, but so last summer, I decided to literally learn a new language, Rothbardian, And I'll be starting courses soon on that. And you had to learn each word, and you had to translate it. And at the very beginning, I was ready to throw in the towel. It took about a day, and I had 2 sentences down. But then it kind of picked up, and you learn more and more. And it was about a month and a half of really just concentrating. And I was going to sleep, and I was seeing his handwriting in my head. I said, "Oh, I only got 150 pages left." Like, okay, we can do this, Rocky style. So there's more on the actual history of the project, sort of going through this in a new issue of the Austrian. I'm sure you can find it downstairs, assuming the other fellows haven't thrown them all out by now. We talk about this project, and you're really interested. I'm happy to talk more about it. But so that's the history of the project, and that's the actual handwriting. So there's about 600 pages of this. Okay, but it was a great experience doing so. All right. So enough about the actual history of the project. What's the book about? So the book, as his other Conceived in Liberty volumes, is divided into parts, and then there's subsections. And so what this book, as I've mentioned, is about, it's about a period in history that is actually very rarely spoken about. It's usually kind of rushed over. So you say, all right, you had the Articles of Confederation. They were adopted in 1781. The Revolutionary War ended, and then the great men at the Constitutional Convention, 1787, Constitution, George Washington's president, 1789, and all right, now we're off to the races, sort of. So the 1780s, not really discussed that much. In the Constitution, its adoption is always portrayed as sort of this great event, this significant, rightfully significant, but this beneficial, procedure and the whole 9 yards. And so Rothbard spends a lot of time talking about things that you would never hear about in another American history book. For examples, we'll briefly just sort of mention here. He talks about how a bunch of states in the West tried to secede from the Articles of Confederation, and there was this forgotten state called Franklin that's literally sandwiched in like North Carolina, and you can find it on Google, and you're like, oh, well, I didn't know about that. There's a bunch of those kind of lurking in the mist. But so part 1 and 2, he discusses sort of the 1780s, the economic environment, and then the foreign policy under the Articles of Confederation. He goes through that. He explains how many of all the problems were due to sort of government intervention and how things weren't as bad as they were actually portrayed. And then part 3 is really where the narrative kind of picks up. And he discusses, you see all of the parts, it's the nationalist triumph, the nationalist triumph, the nationalist triumph, the nationalist triumph, right? So he goes through this huge series of steps as how the supporters, I'll be talking about the nationalists a little bit more later on, how the supporters of a stronger central government basically secured a plethora of extremely crucial victories. So first they call a constitutional convention. All right, they say they're going to do something else. They say they're going to do it legally, but, they lie, basically. So they call a constitutional convention. It's in secret. They draft this constitution, all right, at the constitutional convention. All right, then they got to ratify it, again, illegally, as we'll talk about, not by the normal procedure of the Articles of Confederation. And then they have to pass a Bill of Rights to for the fears of those people who didn't want the Constitution. They had to basically calm them down. And as we'll talk about, the Bill of Rights was actually very different than what many of the people who are later known as the Anti-Federalists wanted. So that was even a victory for the nationalists, okay? So this is just sort of a brief overview, and then we'll be kind of going through each part in more depth, all right? So the year was 1784. Remember it like it was yesterday, right? It was the end of the Revolutionary War. So now we're going to go through your elementary school history class, really fast. This one bullet point: the end of the Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, and these final 3 points Rothbard talks about in Conceived in Liberty, Volume 4. So you have the centralizing Articles of Confederation enacted. So as Judge Napolitano mentioned in his Monday night talk, most people would say that the Articles of Confederation, wholly inadequate, total chaos, totally decentralized, it was weak, and only Rothbard, the historian, would call it the halfway house to a stronger government, the Constitution. So, Rothbard spoke about how the Articles of Confederation was a centralizing measure to actually, it caused problems. Instead, the 13 colonies, soon to become 13 independent states, should have remained just that, independent, or at least in separate confederacies. Then you have a failed power drive by Robert Morris. So he was a major financier, the guy in charge, the treasurer in charge of the Revolutionary War, enormously influential to someone who I'm sure many of you are more familiar with, and that's Alexander Hamilton. And then you have the Treaty of Paris formalizes U.S. independence in 1783. All right, so here we are, 1784. We're all caught up. We can now pass our AP U.S. history course and all of that. So the Confederation Congress, it was called the Continental Congress before the Articles of Confederation. Now it's called the Confederation Congress. And the states have a huge wartime debt. This is the central problem, basically, of the 1780s. And it's increasingly held by wealthy speculators. So why'd they have such a huge debt? Basically, the United States, or the colonies, at least initially, they made the choice to fight the war with a formal army rather than sort of guerrilla warfare. And this is a very important point that Rothbard discusses in Conceiving Liberty, Volume 4. He says guerrilla warfare, it's the more libertarian way of fighting. You need a less regimented, ossified, bureaucratic structure. It's less expensive. People know their own home territory. And this was actually where all of the United States, or the Patriots, basically, victories came from. It was mainly in guerrilla warfare, ambushes, et cetera, not pitched battles. And this is why he sort of looks downly upon George Washington, because he wanted to fight many of his battles sort of, pitched battles. And, his most successful victory, Trenton, where he crosses the Delaware River Christmas night, was precisely an ambush attack. So it's not like, hey, we're going to meet you at this, this field, 5 o'clock, be there, bring the drinks. How it was done back in the day. So, and this is discussed, and usually when historians mention this, they say, this debt that you had to pay farmers and soldiers with, you had to pay it off because it's held by the people who fought the war. The poor farmers, who gave their crops, the soldiers, etc. But in reality, as Rothbard mentions, this is the point that isn't really properly emphasized, is that it was all those people, most of those people sold their securities at vastly depreciated rates to speculators. They needed money now. They couldn't wait 10 years for the government to pay them off. So it was held by wealthy speculators, and it was also held increasingly in the North in particular. So Rothbard's solution, basically, you have this federal debt as well as the state debt. You should have divided it up among the states and then let them default or repudiate however they felt. So a decentralized method. So default is when you just stop making some payments, and repudiate is when you just totally cancel the contract. You don't give them anything. And this was something Rothbard would discuss multiple times, that the debt, you don't actually need to pay off government debt. It's backed by basically a coercive means of payment, all right? Taxation. So in terms of the massive federal debt we have now, it would take so long, it would take an enormous amount of tax revenue to actually pay it off. The best way is basically to default, or even better, to repudiate the national debt. So some states defaulted by printing money, basically just paying creditors or the debt holders in depreciated money, saying like, all right, this is what you get, take it or leave it. Others raised taxes, right? And both of these caused problems of their own, as I'll discuss. So this is the year 1784, ... And, well, what we also have in 1784 is a depression, okay? So at the end of the Revolutionary War, you have a war-ravaged economy. Independence came at a very high price. So you had hyperinflation, printing the continental currency. You had military confiscation of goods. You had the British pillaging of infrastructure and supplies. And you had the flight of loyalists in their capital. Okay, so the loyalists were those colonists who said, I want to stick with Great Britain. So they leave to Canada, to the British West Indies, or back to Great Britain proper. So, you have that enormous shock. And then after the war, the U.S. had to readjust to trading realities. Okay, so during the war, a whole bunch of artificial manufacturing was stimulated because basically they weren't allowed to trade legally with Great Britain anymore. So after the war, Great Britain says, all right, we'll export our goods to you, but they're still stuck in the thralls of a mercantilist fallacy, but they say, all right, you're not allowed to export to us, particularly the British West Indies. All right, so that naturally hurts us. That's a negative government interference, basically hampering our trading capabilities. And now you also have efficient British manufactured goods outcompeting inefficient Americans, right? Because all of this American manufacturing, that was only basically profitable because it was the wartime economy, all right? So you have these massive trade adjustments that have to occur. It's beneficial. There's going to be a process, though. And then you have sort of a brief boom-bust credit expansion from the Bank of North America, the Bank of Massachusetts, and the Bank of New York that Rothbard discusses. And all of these basically lead to a problem that many Americans thought there was a huge issue, is this chronic excess of imports, okay? And the really sort of the excess, quote, of imports came from all the negative government shocks that caused this. And it led to sort of stagnation in the economy, all right? And this depression, of course, was aggravated by states printing money in raising taxes to pay off their debts. Okay, so many states, in particular Massachusetts, drastically raised taxes. Okay, which really hurt a lot of people who were, they just suffered from under the war economy. It was hard for them to pay off. It was hard for them to pay the taxes, and then the government was taking their goods, throwing them in debtor's prison. In Shays' Rebellion, a very significant event so Daniel Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts, it was a big significant event behind the Articles, scrapping the Articles of Confederation, moving the Constitution. As Rothbard discussed, it was mainly a tax revolt. Massachusetts primarily put their taxes on the poor interior farmers. Okay, so naturally they're going to revolt. States also erected tariffs and navigation acts. So navigation acts are various regulations on shipping, but interstate competition made them very ineffective. So the extent that point is ever spoken about in American history class, you say, oh, all these states enacted all these barriers, and there was all sorts of problems, because if you wanted to, buy goods from Pennsylvania and you lived in New Jersey, you had to pay, like a 90% tariff. Actually, the tariff rates were quite low, and that's simply because of competition, all right? If one state has high tariffs or strict navigation acts, other states are sort of incentivized to undercut them, all right? So what you really need in order for tariffs in these types of regulations to work is you need a national tariff, or a national navigation act. But the issue is that those failed under the Articles of Confederation because particularly to raise revenue, that was the one power the Articles of Confederation did not have, and everyone, when you hear about them talk about it, they wail, they complain, they say the government did not have the power to raise revenue, and Rothbard was like, that's great, okay, because they can only rely on the states for voluntary requisitions, and generally the states were parsimonious with those requisitions. So if you separate the power of the purse from the power of the sword, it's actually a good mechanism. So those failed, and that was because primarily to get a tariff, you need to have unanimity. So every state legislature, in order to pass an amendment to have a tariff, had to agree to it. In these two main drives, basically one state, Rhode Island and then New York, refused to pass it. So even with all of this, the economy was not as bad as contemporaries argued. And usually those contemporaries who argued that the economy was bad, they were in favor of a stronger central government. Okay, so they say, oh, it's chaotic. We need a stronger central government. We need to revise the Articles because of all of these problems that were going on. In the Confederation Congress, 1786, 1787, they were about to throw in the towel on the debt. So they were going to say, all right, we can't pay off the federal debt. We're going to have to just divide it up amongst the states and then let them do as they please, okay? And if that happened, that would have kind of meant the end in the sense that the Confederation would have been permanently weakened, and it would have either remained in this weakened state or it would have broken up into various confederacies and so on. So by 1787, of course, that's not the path that was taken, and instead you have the nationalist forces are coalescing. So the nationalists are those groups that they didn't want a confederation of basically separate states where power is decentralized. Instead, they wanted a nation where you have centralized power. And the states are in a greatly weakened condition, and you say all but emasculated, basically. So you have this group of people. You have speculative public creditors. They want the debt paid off. Okay, they want the government to pay it off at its face value because they bought it at such a depreciated price they would stand to make a killing. And that eventually happened under Alexander Hamilton's, basically one of his first major policies as Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington. You have ex-army officers. They want a strong standing army, okay, because they want it to be sort of hereditary. They want to belong to this army interest group they can benefit from. You have manufacturers who want a centralizing tariff to block out more efficient Europeans producers. You have merchants who want a centralizing navigation act to block out European shippers. You have land speculators who have claims to land, even though it's not really just claims. They didn't really homestead it. They want to prevent Western secession. Various states and regions linked up with the Mississippi River might secede and sort of break off and join with Spain, owned the Mississippi River at that time. You have Southerners who want to control the Spanish Mississippi River. You have land speculators and Northerners who want to control the British Northwest, or at least get them to leave their forts. You have Southern slave owners who want to protect slavery and encourage the spread of slavery. And you have commercial farmers who want an aggressive foreign policy in the West Indies and Europe. So you have all these groups, and who are they against? They say we want to benefit at the expense of basically the poor interior farmer in the West, which also just so happen to be the majority of the country. All right. So you say, all right, we want all these special privileges, and of course they disagree amongst themselves, but what's the one thing they agree on? They say we want a stronger government. So they're coalescing, and they leave it up to James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. James Madison, Virginia, Alexander Hamilton of New York. So they go to work, so to speak. So they're very famous partners during this this process. And then in the 1790s, quite famously, they split. So they're no longer besties, basically. They used to be great friends. Now they don't even talk. So they organize a all-state convention to revise the Articles of Confederation legally. Okay. So what I mean by legally is that means you stick to revising the articles. So you're not going to create a new government. You stick with the actual government of the Articles of Confederation, and then the revisions must be first approved by the Confederation Congress and then the state legislatures unanimously. That's how, if you want to actually bring about revisions in the Articles of Confederation, that's the way you got to do it, okay? So that all-state convention is the Philadelphia Convention from late May to September 1787, and it's dominated by nationalists. So it's mainly in control of the people who want a stronger government. There's only a couple of people who are actually would later be called anti-federalists. They want to keep the Articles of Confederation, or they want only some minor revisions. So naturally, if the convention's dominated by people who want stronger government, what are you going to get? You're going to get a stronger government. So you have most of the prominent people in American history there. There are some notable absences. John Adams is away, minister to England. Thomas Jefferson, minister to France. Patrick Henry, sort of the fiery Virginian who said, give me liberty or give me death. He declined to attend because he said he smelt a rat, and that turned out to be correct. And you have some others, but you have all the famous. You have George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, Robert Morris, Gouverneur Morris. You have the whole cast of characters. They're all there. All the same people who are trying to push for a stronger government in the early 1780s during the Revolutionary War. They're back for the party 6 years later. So this is Rothbard's quote. You could spend a whole lecture, you could spend a whole week on the Constitutional Convention. So he goes through the U.S. Constitution. This is sort of a great summary. And he says, the Constitution is unquestionably a high nationalist document. This is very important because we'll talk about later sort of common perceptions of the Constitution. And then he goes through various things. He says congressional selection of the president was changed to chosen by popular election, all right, actually to weaken the power of the states and indirectly the people. Admission of new states was made purely arbitrary. Okay, this was to keep the eastern states in domination. The amendment power was transferred from the states to the Congress to basically keep the federal government in control of amendments. And then loopholes existed in the enumerated list. So you see how, oh, the government, it's strictly enumerated powers. And you go through, all right, so you go through some of these, the National Supremacy Clause, the dominance of the federal judiciary, the virtually unlimited power to tax, raise armies and navies, make war, and regulate commerce, the necessary and proper clause, the powerful general welfare loophole, all allowed the virtually absolute supremacy of the central government. Okay, so you have a lot of loopholes that, and truth be told, if you look at actually the progress of how more and more invasive features government intervention in American history were justified, it was mainly through a lot of these clauses. Rothbard continues, and he says, while libertarian restraints were placed on state powers, which was good, he said, no Bill of Rights existed to check the federal government. That was done on purpose, because the nationalists were okay with restricting the powers of the states, but not the power of the federal government. And he says, and quite crucially, he says, and slavery was cemented into American society by the nationalist 20-year guarantee of the slave trade, in the 3/5 clause representing slaves in Congress, and in the compulsory fugitive slave clause. The Northern nationalists were willing, if shamefacedly, to agree in exchange for the right to regulate commerce, and thus grant themselves commercial privileges, while the Southern nationalists were willing to concede regulation of commerce in confident expectation of an early slave state preponderance in Congress for the South and Southwest. Okay, so the North wanted many of their mercantilist regulations, the South wanted those too, but the South said, okay, we have to be able to protect slavery. So if you didn't have the Constitution, you can imagine a sort of a decentralized way, which was actually what was occurring in the 1780s, of slavery dying out peacefully, at least unlike the Civil War later. So all right, you have this high nationalist document. All right, now you gotta ratify it some way. All right. So the Constitution basically illegally said that the Confederation Congress did not have to approve the document. I mean, they sent it to them anyway, and they said, all right, what do you think? If you like it, great. If not, oh well, we're still doing this. And then the U.S. Constitution was sent to special, quote, ratifying conventions rather than the state legislatures, explicitly because the people at the convention knew that it would be easier to pass. And then they said only 9 states were needed, not unanimity. So there's nothing actually illegal about the whole thing. Even if you charitably say the U.S. Constitution was an amendment, you just say the giant thing was an amendment, though the actual process was not according to the rules, so to speak. And at this point, there were really 2 sides. You had the Federalists, the Nationalists. Okay, they called themselves Federalists for tactical effect. They say, oh, it's a strictly limited government, powers diffused among the executive, the legislative and the judiciary. In reality, they were nationalists. And then they called the true Federalists anti-Federalists, all right? And that just doesn't sound nice. If you say someone's anti, like if you had the 2-party system where the Democrats and the anti-Democrats, or the Republicans and the anti-Republicans, one of those is just going to win. When you say that you're anti, it's just, you're just negative, all right? Looking at the glass half empty. And the actual ratification process, which is, in my opinion, the my favorite part of the book, it's not the social contract theory of state formation, and is what we're taught in schools, that we all get together, we all agree, we all unanimously agree to a government, we all hold hands, and then, we're happy, and then we not only sign our lives away, we sign our children's lives, and our children, we all agree to this thing in, basically forever. In reality, it fits much more with the conquest or the coercive theory, where a government is sort of coercively imposed on people against their will, and then they just sort of learn to get used to it, basically. So you look at the ratification debates, and the Federalists had the advantage. Undeniably, they had the advantage. One, they had superior leadership. The more eminent men, America's great men, as Rothbard calls it, were in favor of the government. Why? Because as Rothbard discusses, he says great men are almost always generally in favor of bigger government, because that's how they got their power, or that's how they can continue to augment their power. The Federalists also had control of the newspapers and the mail. All right, so much they had control of all the great newspapers of the day, like Facebook and Twitter and CNN and Washington, the Washington Post, etc. But they would basically stifle opposition. It would take longer for anti-federalist mail to be delivered, and sometimes the mail would be opened up and cut up and all this stuff. And they generally, sometimes they lied, but about anti-federalists. So naturally, if you control the newspapers, which back in the day was, the vital, source of information, you're naturally going to be able to sway more people. Very crucially, in fact, this was really the main reason why the Constitution was ratified, was there's a malapportionment of delegates. To these state conventions, much like the existing state legislatures, the western regions were underrepresented. Okay, so they weren't actually able to send as many delegates as their population warranted. Okay, so, and this was something that naturally the older eastern sections did on purpose in the state legislatures as well as the Constitution to basically increase their weight. Right, so it's like an ancient form of gerrymandering. All right, they bribed anti-federalist delegates. Okay. Quite crucially as well, they promised them restrictive amendments after ratification, which is saying like, all right, give us the keys to complete power, and we'll do what we say after you give us the keys, right? Which isn't really the best way, kind of doing things. You say, no, why don't we do this before? Some parts of the states actually threatened to secede unless the state would ratify. New York City threatened to break off from New York. New York was an enormously anti-federal state. They said, we're going to secede. One of the main reasons was, or two of the reasons were they were hit hard by the Depression, and they were also the existing capital, the site of the Confederation Congress. And so if they weren't allowed to be in the new government, all the power and the privileges, the swamp would basically move. So they wanted to keep it there for a little bit. And then there was actually threats of hostile retaliatory trade legislation against those states that didn't join. So little Rhode Island was the last state to basically of the original 13 states to join. And why did they do so? It's because draconian trade legislation was basically impending in the Senate. In the new U.S. Senate, if they didn't join, they said, all right, you don't have to join, but we're basically going to, just quarantine you, for lack of a better term. So Rothbard goes through fascinating discussions in Massachusetts, in New York, in Virginia, sort of the toughest large anti-federal states. He goes through how sort of all the chicanery, one of his favorite words he uses, and just general shenanigans occurred to basically allow all of these states to very, barely ratify to join. And it talks about how actually they didn't represent the true, the population of the state's wishes, and so on. So then we go to the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution was ratified in the summer of 1788. New Hampshire is the 9th state, and Virginia and New York followed. They follow shortly thereafter. And then North Carolina and Rhode Island ratified later. So actually, when George Washington was initially inaugurated, 2 states had not yet ratified. And the anti-federalists, they were fuming, right? Because they were upset. They said, we've been tricked, we've been cheated. They said, all right, you promised us the restrictive amendments, restrictions on taxing, restrictions on national supremacy, on standing armies, and so on. And we want a second constitutional convention, all right, where we can be invited too. And so basically all the Federalists go, no, we're not doing that, because they know what's going to happen. And so in the House of Representatives, Congressman James Madison sort of strategically pushes for a Bill of Rights to sort of thwart the opposition, okay? So there were mainly personal liberty amendments and a weak structural amendment, the 10th Amendment, okay? Which quite crucially, in the Articles of Confederation said expressly delegated, so all powers, they're not expressly delegated to the federal government, are reserved to the states, and now it just said delegated, okay? And that was a bone of contention among many anti-federalists and later was exploited by Alexander Hamilton in the 1790s. And what's also important is the Bill of Rights, we all cherish them now. In fact, most people will probably say the Bill of Rights, particularly like the First Amendment, et cetera, those, the best parts of the Constitution, well, those weren't actually even really part of the Constitution at all. And what's also funny is that the Bill of Rights was more or less kind of discarded by contemporaries. The 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts The Constitution of that was upheld. You can't criticize the federal government. That might violate free speech, I think. I don't know. The Embargo Act, later on, we can talk about this. Search and seizure, and all sorts of rights were also disregarded. So it wasn't really as sort of an ironclad protection, and it sort of later became, as we'll talk about. So just sort of wrap up, the Anti-Federalists, in order to stay relevant, they interpreted the Constitution strictly. So you said, all right, the Federalists lied to us in the ratification debates. We're going to take that lie for our own, to basically make the government you promised us. And along with some Federalists, Thomas Jefferson eventually came out for the Constitution, sort of. James Madison for his own reasons in the 1790s. And so that's how, the strict constitutionalists, they were actually really the sort of the children of the anti-federalists, okay? And in the 1790s, you have the Hamiltonian Federalists versus the Republicans, coalition of anti-federalists and disgruntled federalists by Jefferson and Madison. That last part, that last bullet point, that's just kind of a segue into current history. That's not spoken about so much in the actual book. So that's just sort of the overall narrative. So just in conclusion, really, to wrap this up, so one, Rothbard, as always, provides a unique and radical interpretation of American history. Rothbard also has more after-death publications than Tupac, as someone brought up to me before, and what I think is true. I mean, literally, just new stuff just keeps coming out. And he's been dead since 1995. You should read the book when it comes out in October. And in the meantime, you should read the Progressive Era, which is for sale in the bookstore downstairs. So with that, I think I will stop. Thank you so much.
Marcel is, if you've picked up Marcel's name tag last night at the pool party, he's apparently very fond of it. So if you did find it, find him. He's a tall guy, so he stands out. So thank you.